In the Old West, $30 could buy a dream or destroy one. When a weary man named Jax Corvan bought a small house on the edge of nowhere, he expected peace. Instead, he found two Apache sisters already living there, and a dark secret buried beneath the floorboards. As greed and corruption close in, three strangers must decide what's worth fighting for: land, truth, or each other. Before we begin the story, tell me where you are, and what time it is where you are. Part 1. The Weight of a Promise. The small dwelling stood precisely as sketched on the brittle parchment, a simple structure of weathered timber, 4 walls, and a single door. It was a purchase of meager means, a mere $30, yet to Jax Corvan it represented an immeasurable hope. He stood before it now, the deed clutched in his hand, a testament to ownership, yet the wisps of smoke curling from the chimney whispered a stark contradiction. Smoke had been an unwelcome surprise. The man who'd sold him this patch of earth, Magnus Thorne, swore it was empty, abandoned, ripe for immediate occupation. But someone was undeniably within, someone oblivious to their supposed vacancy. Jax took 3 deliberate steps toward the door, and it swung inward before his knuckles could even meet the wood. A woman filled the frame, her hair a cascade of darkest night, her eyes deeper still, fixing him with a gaze as sharp and wary as one might bestow upon a coiled rattler on their stoop. She offered no words, no movement, only that piercing, unwavering stare. Behind her, deeper within the house's cool shadows, another woman materialized, younger, her eyes mirroring the same unreadable intensity. Neither seemed surprised by his presence. That, perhaps, was the most unsettling detail. Jax cleared his throat, lifting the deed almost instinctively, though its thinness felt woefully inadequate against the silent defiance he faced. The older woman spared it a fleeting glance, then her eyes snapped back to his face. Her lips tightened into a hard, unforgiving line. He waited for her to speak, for any sound at all, but silence stretched between them, taut and challenging. Finally, he broke it, his voice emerging rougher than he'd intended. I bought this place. 3 days passed. A man named Magnus Thorne sold it to me for $30. Her expression remained impassive, yet a subtle flicker ignited within her eyes recognition, perhaps, or a nascent anger. She stepped aside, just enough to unveil more of the interior. A small table, 2 chairs, a pot simmering over the hearth. Unmistakable signs of life, signs that shouldn't be there. We live here, she stated, her voice calm, yet underscored with the unyielding strength of tempered steel. It was neither a question nor an explanation, simply an undeniable fact. Jax felt his jaw clench. He'd ridden for 2 days to reach this remote corner of the territory, leaving behind a life scorched to ash, a grave bearing his wife's name, and the last tattered remnants of his dignity. This house, this humble $30 investment, was meant to be his deliverance, a new beginning that would transform that paltry sum into a fortune, not merely another bitter insult. He glanced past her shoulder at the younger woman, who regarded him with an intensity that stirred a deep discomfort. I don't know what arrangement you had, Jax began, slowly, carefully, but I hold the deed, legal and signed. This house is mine now. The older woman tilted her head, observing him as one might scrutinize a puzzle missing its crucial pieces. You have paper, she countered, her voice low. We have a promise. Jax began to ask for clarification, but before the words could form, heavy, multiple footsteps sounded behind him. He turned to see 3 men emerging from the dusty road, their stride imbued with the kind of arrogant confidence that arises from unchallenged authority. The older woman's face subtly shifted, not quite fear, but something akin to a chilling apprehension. The younger one stepped forward, aligning herself with her sister, and in that moment, with sudden, unwelcome clarity. Jax understood. Whatever trouble was bearing down on them, it was not for him, it was for the women. And somehow, standing on the porch of a house he'd bought for $30, clutching a deed that now felt utterly meaningless, Jax Corvan knew his problems had just become infinitely more intricate. One of the men grinned as he drew nearer, his teeth a yellowed flash in the afternoon sunday. "Well, now," he drawled, his gaze sweeping between Jax and the women. "Looks like the house came with more than you bargained for, friend." But what the man, whose face bore a jagged scar from eyebrow to cheekbone, didn't yet realize was that Jax had already made a decision that would cost him far more than $30 before the sun dipped below the horizon. The three men halted a few feet from the porch, fanning out in a half-circle, like wolves testing the perimeter of a fence. The scarred man kept a hand resting on his belt, a gesture that spoke of intimate familiarity with violence. Jax remained rooted between them and the women in the doorway. Behind him, the older woman stood perfectly still, yet he could feel the palpable tension radiating from her, a heat rising from sun-baked stone. "This your place now?" Wrath, the scarred man, inquired, his eyes sliding from Jax to the women and back again. Jax held up the deed, though his instincts screamed that paper held little sway with these men. "Bought it 3 days ago, legal and proper." Wrath laughed, and his companions joined in, but there was no humor in the harsh sound. "Legal? That's a fine word. You know what else is legal? The agreement these two broke when they stopped paying their rent." Jax felt his chest tighten. Rent? The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "They were renting this house?" he asked slowly. "From who?" The younger woman spoke then, her voice cutting through the growing tension like a sharpened blade. "We weren't renting. We were promised protection." Wrath's smile widened, cold and predatory. "Protection costs money, little bird. You stopped paying 2 months ago. That means the deal's done." He took a step forward. Jax didn't budge. Wrath's eyes narrowed. "You planning on standing there all day, friend? These Riverbend women aren't your concern. You just bought the house. They're separate business." But they weren't separate. Jax knew that with the same certainty he knew the sun would set. Whatever tangled web had been spun here now ensnared all of them. He'd seen this before, back when he still had his farm. Men who traded in fear instead of honest labor. Men who cloaked theft in prettier names. "How much do they owe?" Jax heard himself ask. The older woman behind him made a sharp sound, a mixture of anger and disbelief. Wrath studied him with renewed interest. 2 months at $5 a month, $10 total. But there's interest now. Call it $15 to settle it clean. $15, more than a third of what Jax had left in the world. He could feel the women's eyes on him, sensing their judgment forming. The white man who'd ride in and solve everything with money, probably expecting gratitude he hadn't earned. But that wasn't why Jax's hand moved to his pocket. It was the look in Wrath's eyes, the casual certainty of a man who'd never been told no. The same look the banker had worn when he'd taken Jax's farm, when he'd taken everything. "I'll pay it," Jax said. "But then we're done. No more visits, no more collection. They're clear." Wrath's smile turned cold, truly chilling. "That's not how this works. See, protection is ongoing. Next month, there'll be another payment due, and the month after that, unless—" He let the word hang, heavy with unspoken menace. "Unless what?" Wrath's eyes drifted back to the younger woman. "Unless we work out a different arrangement, one that doesn't involve money at all." The older woman, Kaelen, moved then, stepping forward so swiftly Jax barely registered it. She positioned herself directly in front of her sister, and when she spoke, her voice was low and dangerously soft. "You'll have to go through both of us first." The three men exchanged glances, and something unspoken, a shared understanding, passed between them. Wrath shrugged. "We'll be back tomorrow with more men, and we'll take what we're owed, one way or another." They turned and walked away, their boots kicking up dust on the dry road. Jax watched until they disappeared from sight, then slowly released the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. When he turned back to the house, both women were staring at him, their expressions unreadable. "Why did you do that?" Kaelen asked, her voice still edged with suspicion. Jax looked down at the deed still clutched in his hand. "Because," he said quietly, $30 doesn't buy much, but maybe it bought us one night to figure out what's really going on here." What he didn't say was that he recognized the name on the deed. The signature at the bottom, Magnus Thorne, the same man who'd sold Jax the house, was the same man who'd promised these women protection. And that meant someone had been playing all of them from the very beginning. Kaelen crossed her arms, her eyes locked on Jax with an intensity that made him want to step back. "You think one night changes anything? You think paying them off will make them leave?" Her accent carried the sharp edges of someone who'd learned English as a weapon rather than a tool. Jax folded the deed and slipped it into his pocket. "I think we have until tomorrow to figure out why the same man sold me this house and promised you protection. That seems worth knowing." The younger woman, Lyra, touched her sister's arm gently. "Kaelen, he has a point." Kaelen. So that was her name. The older sister pulled away from the touch, but her stance softened slightly. "And what exactly do you want in return for your $15? She asked Jax. "The house? Our gratitude? Something else?" The accusation in her voice was clear. Jax felt heat rise in his face. "I want to know why I was stupid enough to believe a house this size would cost $30 in the first place." He had lipped to her on. "Now of last matter." Lyra studied him for a long moment, then seemed to reach some internal decision. "My name is Lyra," she said. "This is my sister, Kaelen. We've been living here for 6 months. She gestured toward the interior of the small house. "Magnus Thorne told us this place was safe, that no one would bother us if we stayed quiet, and paid him $5 every month. He said he owned it." Jax felt something cold settle in his stomach. "He told me it was abandoned, that the previous owner died and left no family. Said he was handling the estate." Kaelen's laugh was bitter. "The previous owner was a man named Silas Croft. He didn't die. He disappeared 3 months ago, just vanished one morning, and no one's seen him since." The pieces were starting to form a picture Jax didn't like. "Thorne sold me a house he didn't own, a house where he was already collecting money from you." Lyra nodded slowly. "Which means he's been stealing from everyone. And when those men come back tomorrow, they won't care about legal papers or promises. They'll take what they want." Jax walked to the edge of the porch and looked out at the empty road. The sun was beginning to lower, casting long shadows across the sparse grass. "Why can't you just leave?" he asked without turning around. "Go somewhere else." The silence behind him stretched so long he thought they wouldn't answer. Then Kaelen spoke, and her voice had lost some of its edge. "Because everywhere else is worse." Jax turned back to face them. "What does that mean?" Lyra and Kaelen exchanged a look that held years of shared history, of unspoken hardships. Finally, Lyra spoke. "Our people were moved 4 times, each reservation smaller than the last. Each promise broken faster than the one before. We left because staying meant—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "It meant accepting things we couldn't accept. This house was supposed to be different, small, hidden, ours." Kaelen's jaw was set hard. "But nothing is ever really ours, is it?" Jax thought about his farm, about his wife's grave he'd had to leave behind because the bank owned even that small piece of earth. About the way loss could hollow you out until you were just a shell pretending to be a person. "No," he said quietly. "I guess it's not." He pulled the deed from his pocket again and looked at it in the fading light. Magnus Thorne's signature was there, bold and confident. The signature of a man who'd gotten away with this before. "We need to find Silas Croft," Jax said. "Or at least find out what happened to him. Because if Thorne disappeared him to steal this house, then none of us are safe." "Not really." Kaelin's eyes narrowed. "And how exactly do you propose we do that? Walk into Oakhaven and ask questions? A white man traveling with 2 Riverbend women won't raise any suspicions at all." She had a point. A good one. Jax rubbed his jaw, feeling the rough stubble there. "Then we start with the house itself. Croft lived here for how long?" Lyra tilted her head thoughtfully. "The neighbors said years, maybe 5 or 6. Jax nodded. "People don't just disappear without leaving something behind. If Croft is gone, maybe he left a clue about why." The 3 of them stood there on the porch, as darkness began to creep across the land. 3 strangers bound together by a piece of paper worth nothing, and a threat that would arrive with tomorrow's Sunday. And somewhere in the small wooden house behind them, in the shadows and corners that held years of another man's life, the truth was waiting to be found. But what they would discover in those shadows would prove that sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, and sometimes the people you trust to protect you are the same ones planning your destruction. They started with the main room. Kaelen lit 2 candles, while Lyra pulled back the thin curtains to let in the last vestiges of daylight. The house was sparse. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed against the far wall, and a wooden chest beneath the single window. Jax knelt beside the chest and tried the lid. Locked. He looked up at the sisters. "Did Croft leave a key?" Kaelen shook her head. "We never opened it. When we moved in, it was already locked. We assumed Thorne had taken whatever was valuable." Jax examined the lock. Old iron, rust creeping along the edges. He could force it, but that would destroy whatever evidence might be inside. "I need something thin. A nail, maybe. Or wire." Lyra disappeared through the door and returned moments later with a thin piece of metal she'd pried from the porch railing. Jax worked the lock carefully, feeling for the mechanism inside. His father had taught him this when he was young, back when locked doors meant mysteries worth solving instead of problems worth avoiding. The lock clicked. Jax lifted the lid slowly. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were papers, many of them. He pulled out the first bundle and spread it across the floor. Deeds, 5 of them, each one for a different property. Each one signed by Silas Croft as the owner, and each one countersigned by Magnus Thorne as witness. "He wasn't just a resident," Jax said quietly. "Croft owned property, multiple parcels." Kaelen picked up one of the deeds, her eyes scanning the text. "This one is for a stable on the east side of Oakhaven. And this one," she grabbed another, "a storehouse near the river bend." Lyra was examining a third deed, her brow furrowed. "These are all dated within the same month, 6 months ago, right before we arrived." The implications settled over them like dust. Jax felt his hands tighten on the papers. Thorne witnessed all of these, which means he knew exactly what Croft owned. He knew the man's entire estate. Kaelin's voice was cold. "And then Croft disappeared. And suddenly Thorne is selling properties he doesn't own to people who don't know any better." But there was more in the chest. Beneath the deeds lay a leather journal, its pages yellowed and worn. Jax opened it carefully. The handwriting inside was neat, precise. Silas Croft had been a methodical man. The first entry was dated 8 months prior. March 14th. "Magnus Thorne approached me today with a business proposition. He says he can help me expand my holdings, that he has connections with men who need discreet transactions. I'm hesitant, but the opportunity seems genuine." Jax flipped through the pages, watching as Croft's initial optimism slowly curdled into concern. May 2nd. "Thorne introduced me to his partners today. Rough men, The kind who make their living through intimidation rather than honest work. I'm beginning to question this arrangement. Asterisk. Then, 3 pages later, the entries changed tone entirely. Asterisk, May 18th. I tried to end our partnership. Thorne became threatening, said I was already too deep in their business to walk away, that if I tried, there would be consequences. Asterisk. The final entry was dated 3 months ago. Jax read it aloud, his voice steady despite the chill running down his spine. Asterisk, June 7th. They're planning something. I heard Thorne talking to those men about clearing out the old holdings, about making room for new opportunities. I think they mean to take everything I've worked for. I need to hide these deeds somewhere safe. If anything happens to me, whoever finds this should know. Magnus Thorne is not who he claims to be. He's working with dangerous people, and I fear I'm not the first person they've done this to. Asterisk. The room fell silent. Outside, the last light was fading, and the candles threw long dancing shadows across the walls. Kaelen's face was unreadable, but her hands were clenched into fists. Lyra had gone very still, her eyes fixed on the journal. Jax closed the book carefully. Croft knew they were coming for him. He hid this chest, hoping someone would find it, hoping someone would figure out what happened. Part 2. The Serpent's Coil. They left before sunrise, the 3 of them moving through the gray pre-dawn light like shadows. Jax carried the journal, wrapped in oilcloth, inside his coat, its weight a tangible reminder of the dangerous truth it contained. Kaelen and Lyra had taken only what they could carry on foot, which wasn't much. The small dwelling stood behind them, silent and stark, the $30 investment that had bought Jax Corvan far more trouble than shelter. The walk to Oakhaven took nearly 2 hours. Jax led them through back trails, winding paths that skirted the main road, avoiding the open stretches where Magnus Thorne's men might already be watching. His destination was a livery stable on the edge of town, a place run by a man named Fletcher Knott. They'd worked together years ago, when Jax still had his farm, back when Fletcher was a horsebreaker, a man who built a living with his own hands. But that was before Jax's wife died, before the fire and the ashes, before everything fell apart. He wasn't sure what kind of reception waited for him now, or if a friend from a forgotten past would still remember the man he used to be. The stable came into view as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of soft orange and violet. Jax approached cautiously, the sisters hanging back near a stand of cottonwood trees, their figures almost swallowed by the fading darkness. The place looked much the same as he remembered. Weathered wood, a small corral beside the main building, horses moving restlessly in the early morning chill, their breath fogging in the crisp air. Jax was about to call out when Fletcher emerged from the stable, a bucket of water in each hand, his shoulders stooped slightly with the weight of years. The man stopped dead when he saw Jax, his weathered face registering a slow shock, then something harder to read. A wary curiosity. Jax Corvan, Fletcher said slowly, setting down the buckets with a soft thud. Heard you died or ran off. Stories varied. Jax took a few steps closer, the dust crunching under his boots. Neither. Just got quiet for a while. Fletcher's eyes drifted past Jax, to the stand of cottonwood trees, where Kaelen and Lyra waited, motionless. You traveling with company now? There was no judgment in his voice, just a quiet, searching curiosity. Jax nodded, his gaze fixed on his old friend. It's complicated, and I need help. Fletcher, the kind that might get you in trouble if you say yes. Fletcher studied him for a long, heavy moment, then gestured toward the stable with a tilt of his head. Come inside, all of you. If we're talking trouble, we should do it where ears can't hear. The 3 of them followed him into the dim interior. The air was thick with the familiar, comforting smell of hay and leather, a scent that transported Jax back to a life he'd lost. Fletcher closed the door behind them, plunging the stable into a deeper, hushed gloom, then crossed his arms, his expression grave. "All right, Jax. Tell me what kind of mess you've walked into." Jax told him everything. The $30 house, the sisters already living there, Magnus Thorne's insidious scheme, Silas Croft's chilling disappearance, the journal with all its damning evidence. Fletcher listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with each revelation, his eyes narrowing to slits. When Jax finished, the older man let out a long, slow breath, a sound heavy with unspoken dread. "Thorne," Fletcher said, his voice a low growl. "I should have known that snake was involved. He's been buying up properties all over town for the past year, always at prices too good to refuse, always with papers that look legal but feel wrong." Kaelen spoke up then, her voice sharp with suspicion. "You know him?" Fletcher nodded grimly, running a hand over his chin. "Everyone knows him, or thinks they do. He presents himself as a businessman, a pillar of the community, helping folks in hard times. But I've seen what happens to people who cross him. They lose everything, or they simply disappear, like your friend Croft." He looked at Jax, his eyes searching. "What do you need from me?" Jax pulled the journal from inside his coat, the leather warm against his fingers. "Horses, weapons if you have them, and someone who will stand with us when we take this to the land office." Fletcher's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "The land office is in Thorne's pocket, Jax. So is the sheriff. You walk in there with that journal, and you'll be arrested before you can even open your mouth. Sixtrenses wilver the slet mind. And record." Lyra stepped forward, her quiet strength resonating in the shadowed stable. "Then who isn't in his pocket? There has to be someone in this town with enough authority to listen." Fletcher was quiet for a moment, thinking, his gaze fixed on a distant point. "There's a territorial judge passing through tomorrow. Name's Harlan Briggs. He handles disputes that cross county lines. If you could get that journal to him, he'd have the authority to investigate." A flicker of hope ignited within Jax, a spark in the overwhelming darkness. "Where can we find him?" Fletcher's expression darkened again. "That's the problem. He's staying at the Silver Creek Hotel, which is owned by—" He let the sentence hang, heavy and ominous. Kaelen finished it, her voice flat. "Owned by Thorne." The fragile hope died as quickly as it had sparked. They stood there in the stable, the morning light filtering through gaps in the walls, and Jax realized just how completely Thorne had woven his insidious web through Oakhaven. Every official, every business, every avenue of legitimate help seemed controlled by the same man they were trying to expose. Fletcher moved to a dusty shelf and pulled down a rifle, checking its mechanism with practiced, methodical hands. There might be another way. Briggs takes his meals at the restaurant across from the hotel. It's a public place. If you could get to him there, in front of witnesses, Thorne couldn't just make you disappear. It was risky, a desperate gamble, but it was something. Jax looked at Kaelen and Lyra, seeing the resolute determination in their eyes. "What do you think?" Kaelen's lips curved into a smile, sharp and dangerous as a freshly honed blade. "I think we're already dead if we do nothing. Might as well die trying." But none of them had seen the lone rider approaching the stable at full speed. One of Thorne's men, sent ahead to deliver a message that would change everything, because Magnus Thorne already knew they were coming. The man who'd listened outside the house had ridden through the night, a silent harbinger of doom, and now Thorne was 3 steps ahead. The trap was already set, carefully laid and unseen, and it would spring closed the moment they stepped foot in that restaurant. Part 3. A Desperate Gambit. The lone rider burst into the stable yard, his horse lathered and breathing hard from a furious run, its hooves kicking up dust. He was one of Wrath's crew, Jax realized, recognizing him from the night before at the house. But now his face held no arrogant threat, only raw, unvarnished fear. He dismounted clumsily, stumbling slightly, his eyes wide and wild. "Fletcher, thank God you're here." His gaze swept over Jax and the sisters, a flash of recognition lighting his eyes. "You're the ones from the house." It wasn't a question, but a desperate affirmation. Jax's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle Fletcher had just given him. "What do you want?" This was the Bas Cumin Dialadnanoff. The man held up his hands, palms out, a gesture of surrender. "Not what you think. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to warn you." Kaelin's voice was a sliver of ice. "Warn us about what?" The rider swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. "Thorne knows. He knows you have Croft's journal. He knows you're planning to go to Judge Briggs. And he's got men waiting at the restaurant. 10 of them, maybe more." Fletcher cursed softly, a low growl from deep in his chest. Jax felt his stomach drop, a sickening lurch. "How does he know?" The man looked at the ground, shame painting his face. "Someone stayed behind last night. Listened to everything you said. I didn't want any part of it. But Thorne pays well, and jobs are scarce." Lyra stepped closer to him, her eyes searching his face, looking for the truth in his desperate plea. "Then why are you here now? Why warn us?" The rider finally met her gaze, a flicker of something ancient and weary in his own. "Because I knew Silas Croft. He was a good man, helped me once when I needed it. And what Thorne did to him," he shook his head. "That wasn't right. None of this is right. I'm done being part of it." Jax studied the man, trying to separate truth from deception, in the dimly lit stable. If Thorne had men waiting at the restaurant, their one chance to reach Judge Briggs was gone. If Thorne has men at the restaurant, then we can't get to the judge. Fletcher was already thinking ahead, his mind racing. "Briggs stays one more night. Leaves tomorrow on the morning stage. If we can intercept him before he gets on that stage, away from the hotel, we might have a chance." The rider nodded quickly, relief evident in his eyes. "The stage depot. It's not owned by Thorne. Run by an old woman named Martha Granger. She hates Thorne. Has for years. If you could get there before dawn, before Thorne's men wake up, you could reach Briggs." It made sense. Too much sense. Almost suspiciously so. Jax's gut screamed that this could be another trap, that this convenient defector was leading them into something even worse. But what choice did they have? Every option before them now was a desperate gamble. Kaelen seemed to be thinking the same thing, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. "How do we know you're telling the truth? How do we know Thorne didn't send you here to redirect us into an even bigger ambush?" The rider reached into his coat slowly, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "This is the deed to my mother's house. Thorne took it from her 2 months ago. Same scheme he pulled on all of you. She's living with my sister now, broken and ashamed." He held it out to Lyra, his hand trembling slightly. "I don't want money. I don't want forgiveness. I just want you to give this back to her when this is over, so she knows at least one thing got made right." Lyra took the paper carefully, her fingers unfolding it to verify what it was. She looked at Jax and nodded slightly. It was genuine. The raw, desperate honesty in the man's voice, coupled with the tangible proof of Thorne's treachery, tipped the scales. Fletcher made a decision, his voice firm and unwavering. "We move tonight. Get to the depot before dawn. Wait for the judge. But we don't all go together. Too easy to spot. We split up. Approach from different directions. It is Mylan's bread. And Armand. And Mylan's pride." Jax felt the weight of command settle on him, the heavy responsibility for these people's lives. Kaelen and Lyra take the north route through the residential area. Less chance of running into Thorne's men. He looked at Fletcher. "You and I go through the east side, past the old church." He turned to the rider, his eyes piercing. "What's your name?" The man straightened slightly, a flicker of dignity returning to his posture. "Curtis. Curtis Valentine." Jax held his gaze, his voice low and steady. "Curtis, you're going to go back to Thorne. Tell him you couldn't find us. Tell him we must have gone south toward the county line. Give us as much time as you can. It's not de Staden pots to, and that prevendament Stearns." Curtis nodded, understanding the immense risk he was taking. If Thorne discovered the lie, Curtis would pay with his life. "I'll do what I can." He moved back to his horse, then paused, turning back to them, his face etched with sorrow. "Croft is dead. I'm sorry to tell you that. Thorne had him killed 2 months ago, buried out past the Miller farm in an unmarked grave. I helped dig it." The words hung in the air like smoke, a chilling pronouncement. Kaelin's face went pale, her hands clenching into fists. Lyra's hand found her sister's arm, a gesture of silent comfort. Jax felt rage and sorrow mix into something cold and purposeful, burning deep within him. "Then we make sure it meant something," Jax said quietly, his voice dangerously soft. "We make sure Thorne answers for it." Fletcher checked his rifle one more time, his face grim. "We leave in 2 hours. That gives us time to prepare and still reach the depot before dawn." The group dispersed to make their preparations, each lost in their own thoughts about what the next few hours would bring. Jax pulled out Croft's journal one more time, looking at the careful handwriting of a man who'd tried to do the right thing and paid with his life. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the stable yard, none of them noticed the second rider watching from the ridge above town. This one wore a marshal's badge that caught the light, and he'd seen everything. Because Magnus Thorne always had one more move planned than his opponents expected. And this time, the law itself would be the final trap. Part 4. The Judge's Verdict. They reached the stage depot 30 minutes before dawn, moving through the empty streets like ghosts. Jax and Fletcher approached from the east, while Kaelen and Lyra came in from the north. Martha Granger, the depot keeper, was already awake, preparing for the day's departure. She took one look at the 4 of them, and seemed to understand immediately that trouble had followed them to her door. "Judge Briggs is inside," she said quietly, gesturing to the small waiting room. "But you should know there's a marshal asking questions about strangers in town. He was here an hour ago." Jax felt his chest tighten. The corrupt marshal had already been here, laying groundwork. They were running out of time. He pushed open the door to find Judge Harlan Briggs sitting on a wooden bench, reading a newspaper. The man looked up, his weathered face showing curiosity rather than concern. "Judge Briggs," Jax said, pulling the journal from his coat. "My name is Jax Corvan. I have evidence of systematic land fraud involving a man named Magnus Thorne. Evidence that includes the murder of Silas Croft." Briggs set down his newspaper, his expression sharpening. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Corvan." Jax handed him the journal. "It's all documented. Croft kept detailed records before Thorne had him killed. Property deeds, dates, transactions, everything." The judge opened the journal and began reading, his eyes moving quickly across the pages. The silence stretched as he absorbed what Croft had written. Finally, he looked up. "If this is accurate," he said, his voice resonating with authority, "we're talking about dozens of victims, hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen property." A voice cut through the morning air from outside. "It's also entirely fabricated, Judge Briggs." Magnus Thorne stood in the doorway, flanked by the Marshal Jax had seen watching from the ridge. Thorne was a tall man, well-dressed, with the kind of face that inspired trust. "Judge Briggs, I apologize for the disruption. These people have been harassing legitimate business owners, making wild accusations." But Briggs didn't close the journal. Instead, he held it up. "Is this Silas Croft's handwriting, Mr. Thorne?" Thorne's smile faltered slightly. I wouldn't know, Judge. I barely knew the man. Kaelen stepped forward then, her voice clear and strong. That's a lie. You witnessed every deed Croft signed. Your signature is on all of them. You knew exactly what he owned. Thorne's eyes went cold. The word of a Riverbend woman against mine in any court. The marshal moved his hand to his belt, but Fletcher was faster, raising his rifle. Easy now. Let's hear what the judge has to say. Briggs stood slowly, still holding the journal. I have presided over land disputes for 20 years. I know fabricated evidence when I see it. This journal has the wear patterns of genuine daily use. The ink has aged naturally. The handwriting is consistent throughout. He looked at Thorne and continued. More importantly, I've heard your name before. 3 counties over, there were similar complaints. Accusations that never went anywhere because the local officials were compromised. Thorne's composure cracked. You can't prove anything, Briggs. But Curtis Valentine appeared in the doorway behind him, slightly out of breath. He held a small metal box. Actually, you can. I took this from Thorne's office last night. It has copies of real deeds, the ones he forged new ones from. Every property he stole is documented. Thorne turned on Curtis with pure hatred. You worthless. The marshal tried to intervene, reaching for Curtis, but Martha Granger stepped between them with a shotgun that had appeared from behind her counter. Nobody moves until the judge finishes talking. Briggs took the metal box and examined its contents. When he looked up, his face was set in hard lines. Marshal, you're going to place Magnus Thorne under arrest, and then you're going to explain to me why you were protecting him. The marshal's face went pale. He knew he'd been caught. Within minutes, both men were restrained, and Briggs was organizing their transport to the territorial capital for proper trial. Curtis handed the deed to his mother's house to Lyra. Make sure she gets this. Tell her, I'm sorry it took so long. As the sun rose fully over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Jax found himself standing with Kaelen and Lyra outside the depot. Fletcher had gone to secure the horses. The journal that had nearly cost them everything was now in the judge's possession along with Curtis's evidence box. What happens to the house now? Lyra asked quietly. Briggs had overheard. The properties will be returned to their rightful owners, or in cases where the owner is deceased, sold properly and fairly. He looked at the 3 of them. The house Croft owned was legitimate before Thorne stole it. I imagine it could be purchased for a reasonable price by interested parties. Jax reached into his pocket and pulled out the $30 deed. Now worthless, but somehow still important. We could pull what we have, buy it together, split it 3 ways. Kaelen looked at him for a long moment, then at her sister. Something unspoken passed between them. Finally, she nodded. 1/3 each. Equal shares, equal say. Lyra smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Jax had seen from either sister. Then I guess we're neighbors now. Part 5. A new foundation. 6 weeks had bled into the vibrant tapestry of spring, each passing day a balm on the raw wounds of Oakhaven. 6 weeks since Magnus Thorne and the corrupt marshal had been dragged from the stage depot, their powers stripped, their lies laid bare, destined for a territorial prison where their influence withered to nothing. The dust of their downfall had settled, but the ground beneath it felt firmer, more honest than before. Jax Corvan stood on the small wooden porch, the familiar planks now worn smooth beneath his boots, no longer just a place to stand but a threshold to a life he hadn't dared to imagine. The house, once a stark reminder of his foolish hope and the bitter cruelty of the world, now hummed with a quiet, vibrant energy. Its weathered timber seemed to breathe, imbued with new purpose, new stories. The raw, empty shell he'd first encountered was gone, replaced by something warm and inviting. Beside the house, where before only sparse, Thirsty grass had clung to the hard earth. Kaelen moved with practiced grace among rows of newly turned soil. Her hair, still the color of darkest night, was tied back with a simple leather thong, and her hands, once clenched in defiance, now worked the rich earth, coaxing life from it. A small garden was beginning to flourish, neat rows of young sprouts promising sustenance and beauty. She hummed a low, tuneless melody, a sound Jax had come to recognize as her particular brand of contentment. From within the house, the faint sounds of movement, the gentle thud of wood against wood, signaled Lyra's industrious spirit. She was inside, rearranging the meager furniture, adding touches Jax hadn't noticed at first. A woven blanket draped over the narrow bed, a freshly picked sprig of wild sage placed on the small table. The silence that had once defined the house, a heavy, challenging presence, had been replaced by a different kind of quiet, one filled with the subtle echoes of daily life, of laughter, of whispered conversations around the hearth. It was the sound of a home, being meticulously, lovingly built. The house had ultimately cost them $37 when all the legalities were settled and its true market value assessed, a paltry sum, more than Jax's original $30, but immeasurably more valuable than any amount of gold. For this time, the deed, newly drawn and signed, bore 3 names: Jax Corvan, Kaelen, and Lyra. It wasn't just paper now, it was a pact, a promise forged in the crucible of shared danger, a testament to trust and an unbreakable bond. It meant something real, something earned. That afternoon, the familiar figure of Fletcher Knox rode into the yard, his stooped shoulders straighter now, his face less etched with the weary resignation that had once shadowed it. He dismounted with a groan, then offered Jax a tired but genuine smile. "Heard things are settling down," Fletcher said, leaning against the porch post. Jax nodded, a rare, easy smile gracing his lips. "As much as they ever do. What brings you out this way?" Fletcher reached into his satchel. "News. From Oakhaven." He pulled out a folded paper, a deed identical to the one Curtis had given Lyra. "Curtis rode out this morning. His mother's moving back into her house next week. He wanted me to tell you. He said he owes you all a debt he can never repay." Fletcher handed the deed to Jax. "He's leaving Oakhaven, heading west, looking for a place where a man can start fresh, truly fresh, without a past looking over his shoulder." Jax took the paper, feeling the crispness of the new legal document, the weight of justice finally served. He nodded slowly. Good. He earned it. He stood up when it counted. The satisfaction wasn't just for Curtis, but for all of them. The chain of Thorne's deceit had been broken, its ripple effect slowly receding, leaving in its wake the possibility of healing. As the sun began its slow, majestic descent that evening, painting the vast western sky in fiery strokes of orange, crimson, and gold, Jax sat on the porch step, watching the colors deepen. He thought of his own farm, now long gone, swallowed by the relentless maw of debt and despair. He thought of his wife's grave, a solitary mound in a forgotten field, a marker for everything he'd lost. For years, home had been a concept burned to ash, a hollow ache in his chest. He had been a shell, moving through the world, disconnected, merely existing. But now, looking at the small wooden house, at Kaelen's growing garden, at the warmth emanating from the open door where Lyra's quiet movements could be heard, something fundamental had shifted. Home, he realized, was never truly about the walls that defined a space, or the price paid for the ground it stood upon. It was about the people who chose to stand with you when the world tried its hardest to tear you apart. The people who looked at you not with suspicion or judgment, but with a fierce, quiet loyalty forged in shared struggle. A voice, soft but insistent, carried from the doorway. "Jax, dinner." It was Kaelen. He rose, the slight stiffness in his joints, and a familiar companion, but the weariness in his soul felt lighter. He stepped into the house, and the aroma of freshly baked bread, warm and earthy, enveloped him. Lyra stood by the small table, setting out simple bowls of stew. The flickering candlelight cast long, dancing shadows, making the small space feel intimate, safe. For the first time in years, Jax Corvan didn't just feel present, he felt rooted. He belonged somewhere. Not because of a piece of paper or a purchased property, but because three strangers, brought together by deceit and desperation, had chosen to become something far more profound. They had chosen to become family. Their future was uncertain, the frontier wild and unforgiving. But for this moment, in this small, hard-won house, they had found a new foundation, a foundation built not on paper or promises, but on courage, justice, and the unexpected bonds of the human heart. If this tale of resilience, justice, and the forging of unexpected bonds resonated with you, consider exploring other stories where courage changes everything. Don't forget to connect with us, and your continued support helps us bring more narratives like this one to life. Your engagement means the world. Justice in the Old West was rarely clean, but it was earned. For Jax Corvan, Kaelen, and Lyra, $30 bought more than a cabin, it bought a new beginning. They faced deceit, fought corruption, and built something that money could never buy: family. In the end, their home wasn't made of wood and nails, but of courage, loyalty, and forgiveness. Thank you for riding with Old West Stories, where every scar hides a story, and every story carries the heart of the frontier. If you enjoyed this tale, subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from.